the plantations, and the cotton industry, and through their wealth they controlled American politics from the North to the Deep South. The history books tell us that the issues of slavery and states' rights led the United States down the path to civil war. But most Americans did not own nor trade slaves, or even own the plantations that required the work of slaves. The average citizen also did not own the textile mills that processed the cotton produced on the slave plantations. A handful of elite and wealthy people did, and they stirred the public to racial hatred and the Civil War. The southern United States was one of the few remaining areas that still practiced slavery, as did Portuguese Brazil and Spanish Cuba. As the causes of the war are studied, it appears that the free states of the North were opposed to the slave states of the South. The lines were 228, the Masonic betrayal 229, not always geographical. An abolitionist movement did exist in the North, especially in states that enjoyed no commercial benefits from slavery. The abolitionist movement existed in the South and the West as well. In the North some people did benefit from the slave trade, and as a result they formed some odd alliances that fought against the tide of emancipation in the 20 years prior to the war. One such alliance was that of Northerner Caleb Cushing and two Southerners, John Anthony Quitman, the governor of Mississippi, and Jefferson Davis. Although Cushing was an active and high-ranking Mason, his mentor, Daniel Webster, advised him to move out of his Newburyport, Massachusetts, home because of his unpopularity. But the 33rd-degree Mason controlled the plantation trade and the opium trade from his mansion, and had friends in high places. Cushing's co-conspirator John Anthony Quitman was born in the Roosevelt territory of Rhinebeck, New York, but moved to Mississippi to become Grand Master of that state's Masonic hierarchy. He was the Grand Master for 17 years. His power in the lodge and the Capitol building of Mississippi gave him unbridled ambition, and he was very active in determining the fate of Texas. Quitman, who was against the admission of any new states as free states, proposed raising an army and marching west to conquer the new territory that had been taken from Mexico. It was an act of treason that caused Quitman to be brought up on charges of violating American neutrality laws. The other co-conspirator, Jefferson Davis, would later become President of the Confederate States. The three conspirators joined forces to get General Franklin Pierce into the White House. The enemy of this alliance was President Zachary Taylor, who had assumed the presidency in March 1849. Taylor, a slaveholder, had wanted the southwestern states to be admitted as free states. In February 1850 the new president called a meeting of Southern leaders and told them he would hang secessionists who took arms against the Union with less reluctance than he had hanged deserters and spies in Mexico. It wasn't the last time he threatened 230 from the sacred to the profane hanging. Taylor again publicly spoke out against those who committed acts of treason. He specifically referred to Quitman and his cabal, threatening to see them hanged for their deeds. The very next day, July 4, 1850, the president took ill. The day was to be a celebration of both the independence of the country and the consecration of the almost finished Washington Monument. It was very much a Masonic celebration, as was everything surrounding the erection of the obelisk. When work was started 2 years before, the architect wore George Washington's Masonic apron. The stone was quarried from a quarry owned by a Mason. 21 lodges were in attendance at the monument's dedication. President Taylor, who was surrounded by enemies, did not realize his days were numbered. Later some would insist that the general who had blazed through Mexico in much greater heat to win a war could not handle the climate of Washington. His death, it was said, was brought on because Taylor drank too much cold milk and ate a large quantity of cherries during the celebration, which allegedly causes a stomach inflammation. Many believe that Taylor was the victim of a plot. Numerous people survived the July 4th picnic. Investigative techniques may not have been as developed back then as they are today, but arsenic was a well-known poison in the 19th century. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning include nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. Taylor exhibited these symptoms, yet somehow the diagnosis was an overdose of cherries and cold milk. Arsenic can be easily discovered in the body, as it is deposited in the fingernails and hair. When the body of the president was exhumed in 1991 to test for arsenic, the poison was detected, although not in a large enough quantity to kill him. The test was done 140 years after Taylor's death, however, rendering the results inconclusive. John Quitman and his cohorts were not hanged as Zachary Taylor had threatened. Instead, Quitman was elected to Congress, and the conspirators succeeded in getting their man into the White House. When Franklin Pierce was sworn in, Caleb Cushing was rewarded with the Masonic Betrayal 231 post of Attorney General, and Jefferson Davis became Secretary of War. Governor Quitman was exonerated of criminal charges. Cotton Whigs in those critical years, the Whig Party of the North relied on the leadership of the aristocrat Robert C. Winthrop, who was not concerned with the slavery issue. Although the anti-slavery movement was strong among the common voters, the people in Winthrop's class, the shippers, merchants, insurers, and railroad builders, relied on cheap labor. But instead of relying on blacks for labor, Northerners exploited the immigrants and the average citizens. The Whig ties with the plantations of the Deep South and the English banking establishment, which financed the cotton trade, were strong. Georgia planter and Mason Howell Cobb led the Southern Democrats. Cobb was an aristocrat who owned more than 1,000 slaves. Between Cobb and Winthrop there was an attempt to maintain the status quo. The spoiler was a party called the Free Soilers, an anti-slavery group that had a poor showing in the presidential election, but was riding groundswell of abolitionist opinion. The fateful 10 years between Pierce and Lincoln witnessed the destruction of the Whig Party, as it became obvious that the group was playing to the Southern elite. As the anti-slavery movement grew, the Republican Party replaced the Whig Party, and the anti-slavery movement finally had a candidate, Abraham Lincoln. As the movement against slavery grew, the opposition to it became more violent and secretive. The Knights of the Golden Circle, which was founded by Dr. George W. L. Bickley in Ohio, had secret passwords, handshakes, temples, sworn oaths, and supreme councils. It drew its membership from Masonic lodges. The Knights of the Golden Circle attempted to create one huge slave state, and its largest membership came from Texas, where Governor Sam Houston was a member. With its funding from England and its push towards secession, the group would be, in the eyes of Abraham Lincoln, the greatest threat to 232 from the sacred to the profane in the United States. Lincoln had 13,000 members arrested for disloyalty, with Bickley himself being charged with spying. 1 The Knights of the Golden Circle were then led by General Albert Pike, a 33rd-degree Mason. He too recruited among Masonic lodges, often in the border states and Ohio. Pike also recruited among the Native American tribes. In the spring of 1860, Pike raised a 32nd-degree to Pitchlyn, the chief of the Choctaw Nation, Holmes Hulbert, National Secretary of the Chickasaw, and Elias Boudinot of the Cherokees. Before the war, Pike was a member of the Democratic American Party, which is commonly known as the Know-Nothings. He joined the Confederacy, and was among the numerous Masons picked by fellow Mason Jefferson Davis to run the Confederate States. After the Civil War, Pike was the driving force of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, in which he was the Chief Justice. This organization also recruited among Masonic lodges, and in some areas the local Klan membership was limited to Masons. Though the Klan was started in 1866, it was officially disbanded after 3 years as the wave of violence and riots incited by the organization created a backlash. In 1905, Walter L. Fleming wrote a pro-Klan book featuring the late Pike on the cover. The organization started up once more, again drawing its membership from Masonic lodges. Somehow Pike, who had been charged with treason for his role in the Civil War, has been honored with a statue in Judiciary Square in Washington.